Well, happy Friday if you're in a level 2 part of New Zealand and you're out enjoying your freedom and not watching Act TV, good on you. If you're in a level 2 part and you're in watching Act TV, even better, what a great commitment to our democracy. And if you're in Auckland, still under level 4, we're sorry, and as a fellow Aucklander, I feel for you. These are just the things that go on. All we can hope is that these so-called mystery cases, which are increasingly being discovered, cases unlinked to any other households or known contacts, are an aberration and a failure of contact tracing to link them rather than the edges of new clusters that we're yet to discover. I suspect over the next few days, more of that information will become clear, and let's hope it becomes clear in time for the government to make an alert level decision, shifting Auckland down to at least alert level 3 on Monday. It's all about information, it's all about testing, and if you are in Auckland, if you feel even just a little bit sniffly or you have been to anything like a contact centre, or a location of interest, then it's well worth you getting out and getting a test. The more data and information that's out there come Monday, the better able the government will be to make a decision, and hopefully the right decision to move Auckland down to level 3 so people can get a little bit of their freedom back. It's been a really interesting day for us, talking to a whole lot of people in the hospitality community. At midday, we had a Zoom call that we broadcast live on my Facebook. You can still watch the video there, where we had over a dozen hospitality business operators, some of them quite small, others with groups of bars and restaurants that employ collectively hundreds and hundreds of people. But they all told the same basic story. They cannot operate under these new level 2.5 conditions, or at least not in a way that they break even. It's often better for them to stay closed, even if they're legally able to. They also told us that this new level 2.5 was sprung on them too late. Many of them had been preparing for a long time, getting back in the saddle, paying off debt from the last lockdown and getting their revenue up close to where it was pre-COVID. But to have these new laws sprung on them with so little notice threw a lot of their plans to operate at level 2, if necessary, out of kilter. The other theme that came through was how much these employers are doing to look after and help their staff. They see themselves as being in a pastoral role, and often find that their staff are facing enormous challenges, as are the operators themselves. A final thing that came through was the need for government support. Now, it's not often you'll see the ACT Party saying the government should be spending more taxpayer money, but just think about the case here. You've got a group of businesses that are suffering disproportionately, because if you're an accounting firm, you can actually carry on doing accounting from home fairly well. You just miss out going into the office to meet a bunch of other accountants. On the other hand, if you're a hospitality business, the whole point of your business is that people physically gather. Much like tourism, that's about people moving around, hospitality has a real difficulty with being able to operate under alert level restrictions, anything really above alert level 1. If they're taking a disproportionate burden to achieve this government strategy of elimination, then I think there's a strong case for funding paid for by all taxpayers to compensate them for taking that additional burden. And that's why ACT believes that the resurgence payment should be weekly. It barely touches the sides over a 3 or 4 week lockdown. The government said that they'll do it once more. We think it should be every week that a region's under level 4 or 3, and every week that a hospitality business is under level 2. That would be a proportionate compensation. Getting that resurgence payment, which is $1,500 plus $400 per staff member, to cover all of those other costs such as rates and rent and insurance and electricity. We had one employer on there today who's got a $21,000 insurance bill, has to go out this week, and they have absolutely no revenue to cover it. We had another whose refrigerator compressor had broken down, $2,000, got to go, no revenue, can't open, but if his food spoils, then that costs them even more. We agree with the wage subsidy, it should be made more certain, but bear in mind a lot of these employers were paying maybe $800 a week to keep someone at 80% and receiving only $420 from the wage subsidy scheme. They're hemorrhaging money and they can't operate, and what they want most of all is certainty. So that was a really useful exercise, and it got reported in some, but in our view, not enough media. And we finally came to understand what the practicalities of people running hospitality businesses really are. I want to introduce tonight's guest, though, because we're going to be talking about three waters, and our special guest is indeed special. Her Worship, the Mayor of Whangarei, Sheryl Mai. Sheryl Mai has shown tremendous leadership through this whole issue, where people and running councils up and down New Zealand have been faced with really an offer they can't refuse, or so it seems, from the governments and the Department of Internal Affairs. Here to talk through what's gone on so far. Sheryl, welcome, and great to see you here.
Thank you, David. It's great to be with you to talk about this really important aspect.
Yeah, now can we get it? All good mayors always want to put a plug in for their district. I grew up in Whangarei, out west in Manu. Tell us, how is the North going, and how's it gone through COVID, and what has it got to offer in terms of opportunities right now?
Well, I was really interested in your introduction because, of course, Northland being in level 2, we're pretty happy about that because we can operate almost as good as normal. I'm still working from home, as are many, but certainly buying my fair share of cups of coffee and things like that. But we are cut off because of the Auckland alert level change to level 4, and people can only really transit through Auckland on business purposes. So that's a little bugbear that we've got, but we completely, number one is we want everybody to be safe. But our region, our district is thriving. It is, as you know, a beautiful part of New Zealand, and we've because of the diversity in our economy, we've actually can bounce back pretty well from the impacts of COVID. There are some that are affected way more than others, and it's sad to hear of businesses that weren't resilient enough to survive, but many are thriving. So it's a mixed bag, really.
Yeah, my own view is that, having grown up in Northland and driven up and down that State Highway 1, literally hundreds, probably thousands of times actually, is that the Northland story is just going to get better and better and better as that road improves. New extension, motorway all the way to Warkworth coming up next year, and eventually that will go all the way through, and the attraction of being in the north with its beaches, its climates and its people will only be greater without that rather tough road to drive up there. So good on you, but we really want to talk about what you've done and standing up to a Three Waters proposal that really doesn't seem to stack up. So can we start with the very basics? What has the government proposed that in terms of the management of Three Waters, or even simpler than that, what are Three Waters? Because a lot of people hear that and think, what on earth are you talking about?
So the three waters that we talk about are water, drinking water, stormwater, and wastewater. So there's actually a fourth water called floodwater, and when this first started, that was included as well, but that's been taken off the table. The whole issue around the Three Waters reform was triggered by the awful scenario in Hastings, where there was a Campylobacter outbreak, and 4 people sadly lost their lives. And that was as a result of directly related to the public water supply. Totally unacceptable. And I heard from Mayor Hazelhurst today the amount of investment that they've done to improve their water supply has been phenomenal, and a lot of that has been tax funded, which is appropriate. And it's really important. But what that did was that it triggered a review of how local councils are managing their water assets. And as we all know, we see headlines of boil water notices, lead in town supply. You'll get wastewater spills into the harbour. Drought means there are water restrictions. So this is an important aspect, really, really important.
So that's a really good starting point. That you're not saying it's Hakuna Matata and there's no problem. There are real problems with the Three Waters in New Zealand, whether it's lead in Dunedin, Campylobacter in Havelock North, sewage on the beaches of Auckland, or running out of water altogether in Auckland. But I think it's fair to say that Whangarei has actually got one of the better managed Three Waters sets of infrastructure, and I guess that probably plays into a little bit how each council comes out. They're thinking, it's a little bit like when Auckland merged. Waitakere had pretty rubbish infrastructure and was happy to be subsidised by what used to be called Auckland City. Those of us in what used to be called Auckland City kind of ended up cross-subsidising them. But you guys would say that you're in a good shape, but there is a real need to improve the situation around New Zealand.
There are a number of aspects there. Firstly, thank you for the acknowledgement that Whangarei has actually done a good job. I stand on the shoulders of good governors before me who thought long and hard about water supply. So we've got dams to give supply. They thought about the water treatment. We've just commissioned a new $31 million state-of-the-art water treatment plant. They've put in an innovative wastewater treatment plant, which has polishing into the water before it is discharged. In fact, the water's cleaner when it goes out in the receiving environment. But we've also invested heavily in the improvements to the whole network of wastewater. So kudos to them and kudos to us for continuing that, for managing the assets. And that's probably the key reason why Whangarei unanimously chose to opt out of the Three Waters reform when it was that was the options that we had. You were either in or you could opt out, and we still want that provision to continue. There are other councils that clearly would benefit from a different governance model, and an amalgamated model probably makes sense for some. Some councils have a very high debt level on their assets. Whangarei does not, because we meter our drinking water. We have rated for the wastewater supply because of the public good, and stormwater. It's a poor cousin, but we have invested heavily in our long-term planning with 30-year infrastructure plans. So we kind of feel like we actually know what we are doing. We know what our people need, and we've been good guardians. As I say, there are,
and yet you face having a lot of that taken off you under these proposals, and I think that's what's really got under the skin of people actually up and down New Zealand, from the far north where you are to Bruce Smith on the west coast of the South Island. So what is how would this new proposal work? What would that look like for the pipes that and other infrastructure you're currently responsible for?
The proposal that there has been offered, that we've opted out of, but the rest is around creating large entities. For Whangarei, we would be part of Entity A, which is Auckland and the councils of Northland, so Far North, Kaipara and Whangarei. So that brings to about a 1.2 million population. Makes sense, a big entity, manage the assets. I'm smirking because I'm thinking of water care and some of the problems that they had. So economies of scale may not necessarily be always, bigger is not always better. However, for smaller councils like Kaipara or Far North, it may well be better, like Waitakere benefited, as you talked about before, about the cross-subsidisation. But bear with me, because I've got the thing that really I struggle with, and many other mayors, is the shape of these entities, how they're governed. So they're talking about local ownership or community ownership, but you've got local authorities, mana whenua. Each of those groups appoint a regional representative group. That group appoints and monitors an independent selection panel. That panel appoints and monitors the entity board, which then governs the entity management. I mean, talk about, multi-levels of kind of, in my mind, where do the people who turn their tap on go to if they have a problem? I got to say, you lost me. Yeah. And clearly there would be systems set up. So that itself is one of the main reasons why we opted out. We didn't like the look of that governance board, and we felt that the assets that we have built up over years have been managed well by our council, and we want to and our community wants us to continue managing them.
Yeah, and I want to that's a good segue into the next thing you've done is you've actually, as a council, commissioned a report from Castalia. They're an international economics consultancy who do analysis of some of the claims that people make in economics, and I think it's really valuable to have that scrutiny. So what they've basically said is that if you go into this entity, it might cost $800 or $900 per resident to have the three waters in Whangarei in 30 years' time. But if you don't, it's going to cost $4,000 per resident. And I just look at things, sometimes don't have a lot of time to look at things, but sometimes you can just do the sniff test. And this stinks to high heaven. Under what plausible scenario are you going to make it 5 times cheaper to have the governance structure you just described that I can't follow right off the top of my head? And I don't think anyone can. And as you point out, residents that have a problem will find it very difficult to get accountability. But they're claiming that that's going to make it 50% more efficient on OPEX, 50% more efficient on CAPEX. And then there's a bunch of other things that they did to produce those numbers that just don't really stack up. So you went to Castalia and they basically blew the whole thing out of the water as far as I can tell from reading it. And it seems that at the very least, the government was a little bit too enthusiastic about the savings that your residents would make. And at worst, they've deliberately gone out and screwed the scrum. Can you talk a bit about that report that you've got and what led you to get that report? I mean, I'm glad you did, but what was the initiative behind that?
So, I have a duty to do what's best for our ratepayers. And when we opted out, we actually opted out before the WICS data that you were talking about had been analysed, and we were encouraged to pause and wait until we saw the analysis, because it was going, we were promised it was going to look good. And you're right, under the forecast, under the analysis that was done by WICS, which is the Water Industry Commission of Scotland, and they are world experts, no problem with that. But they were projecting that in 30 years, the costs for our ratepayers, if we didn't join the entity, would balloon out. So we thought, okay, well, if that is correct, then maybe we do need to think twice about this. So we had Castalia. We commissioned Castalia to do the analysis on our behalf to check, was it robust? Was it accurate for us? Should we be taking advantage of this, what seems to be a pretty good deal? And they found that the analysis was definitely not based. They couldn't justify the analysis that was done, and it was some of their assumptions were incorrect, and therefore it skewed the outcome. It certainly and we know what it's like to project out 30 years. At the very best, you can get a thumbsuck and a bit of a sense, but we were being assured that if we didn't opt in, our ratepayers were going to be paying a tremendous amount more. I need to say, the regulator, Taumata Arawai, will be increasing the levels of service standards, and that's good. That's a good thing. We all agree that nobody wants to have lead in their water or another Havelock North. So that itself we agree with.
But I think that's really important to distinguish. So yes, there's been lead, there's been Campylobacter, there's been serious problems. And I would add to that, just getting into some questions. We've had a question from Kath. Why is there a push to reform water services in the first place? Well, I would say, look, there's been some problems. Yeah. And one of the things that the government has done is put in place a national water regulator. So you create some tension between the councils delivering the service and someone else being the referee, because prior to this, in a way, the councils were kind of their own referee, and sometimes that can lead to questionable calls and bad performance. So putting in place a national referee for water quality standards, it's not a bad thing, and I think most people would support that, and I think Cheryl's saying she does, but that's quite separate from changing the governance of how the services are delivered and who governs the infrastructure and controls the water. That's a separate thing. I just add a couple of points for the benefit of Kath. Is yes, it's those high-profile incidents, and we've certainly seen the poor water quality and contamination. We've also seen at the stormwater and wastewater level, often those two services actually literally getting mixed up, putting sewage on the beach. We got in Auckland 50 days of the year the council issues no swim. You can't swim on the beaches in Auckland because there's so much sewage in the water. All of those are perfectly legitimate problems that need to be faced up to. And I'd also add just around development. I mean, one of the things I believe New Zealand needs to do is make it easier for the next generation to build and own a home. Wow, I checked some of the property prices up in Whangarei. It's they're a bit more competitive than Auckland, but pretty pricey. So if we want to be able to build homes more easily, you've got to be able to get the pipes to them. So there's a bunch. Those are some reasons I would give. I don't know if you'd add any more, Sheryl, as to why it is necessary to do something, but maybe not this.
Some of the assets that we're managing are more than 100 years old. So these are pipes that have been in the ground for a very long time. And some of the asset management practices up and down the country have been variable, to be honest. And that's another reason why we need to absolutely get a clear picture of the state of those assets and renewals and depreciation, and make sure that the balance sheet. See, that's one of the other aspects of the reform package that we've been offered, is that with the assets taken off our balance sheet, we actually lose the debt capacity. So there are financial disadvantages for our council, and that's not
a really important point, because it's a bit like having a home that you can mortgage against to do other things if you really need to. But if you lose the asset, your ability to borrow against and provide other services your residents want is reduced. And that's something I don't think has been as widely reported, or certainly not understood as it maybe should have been.
There aren't many councils that are in our position of having limited debt on the assets, which is why some councils are quite keen to opt in, because they will clear a debt. Although interestingly, there's discussion around does the debt actually disappear, and the payments that are made, the Better Off package that was announced, the $2 billion package, part of that is actually funded by the new entities. So it's a little bit of and part of that comes from will be paid, but then you have to clear the debt anyway. So it's convoluted.
So that leads me to another question. With Whangarei opting out, so you're the sort of naughty council of Whangarei for the moment, and I'm sure that Nanaia Mahuta, the Minister for Local Government, will be quite displeased. But does that mean that you don't get what some people have called bribes, but I would just call transfers between central and local governments? Will you still get central government help? Because as you say, like every city in the Western world, actually, a lot of your pipes were built 100 years ago or sometimes more. So what will be your relationship with central government and central government funding under an opt-out scenario?
So if we choose to opt out, that means we'll continue maintaining our assets as we are now. And so there will be no compensation packages. We will just carry on as we are. And there is a risk to our ratepayers, because, as I mentioned before, with the regulator increasing the levels of service, the standards, then we may end up paying a little more. But I think the feeling from our community is that that's okay. We want better water, but we are prepared to pay for that.
Yeah, and that's what I meant at the beginning by an offer that you can't refuse. So if you don't go along with the government's current plan, then basically your residents keep paying taxes to central government, but so far as funding for Three Waters, that will go to places that other people live, which is nice to help them, I guess, but it would be fairer if it came back to Whangarei as well. I was saying to Rochelle, who has asked, will there basically be a tax on rainwater for those with tanks? Can we tax the rain? Well, I mean, you must have a lot of residents who are on tank water, and so that's probably quite a useful thing to address. I mean, are there impositions on them?
So there's a very clear distinction between public supply, and clearly there are a number of people who collect their rainwater and use septic tanks, and they're not impacted by the reforms unless they are deemed to be what they call a supplier, and that's with more than 2 households or more on a supply. So yes, the water standards will need to be met if you're in that category. But for the majority of people who collect their rainwater and are not connected to either potable water, drinking water, or wastewater, systems, no impact at all.
Yeah. So basically, if you've got your house and you've got your roof and your tank and your pump and your filter and your water's going into your taps and your shower, then none of this affects you. But the minute that you run a pipe across to your neighbours, or perhaps you share a bore with your neighbour, at that point you start to actually pay additional. And so I think that's really important to clear up.
You'll become accountable for the quality of that water. And just to clarify, you mentioned before that we're we monitored our own waters. We don't. We meet the Ministry of Health requirements. The regional council have resource consent conditions, etc. So we are accountable, and that's partly the problem. There were a number of agencies that regulated water, which is why it's so much better now with one single regulator.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's actually, and it's important to separate out that that's one good thing that the government's done here. We've got a question here, what's ACT's policy? I will address that a bit later, but I just want to get things for Sheryl. So there's a question of what happens if there is an issue that the Three Waters governance is split over. Does one person or group have veto powers? So I guess, it's quite a convoluted system, but where does the ultimate power lie under this system? Is it with the government? Is it with the new governing board of these new entities if you opt into them? What happens there?
So the service provision will be managed by the entity, the new entity, which will be set up, and then you've got the governance structure above that. So if there were, I would imagine there will be a democratic process on the board, so that there is, decisions are made in that way. We haven't really seen how they will be set up at this point. There will be a transition period, and there's still a lot of detail. There's a tremendous amount of work that's gone on already, to be fair. You can read report after report after report, but the actual granular detail is still yet being sorted through.
So, and just out of interest, I mean, if Whangarei opts out, but your neighbours opt in, you could kind of end up splitting them in half, because you've got the Far North District Council to the north, the Kaipara District Council to the south. I mean, who knows where Auckland goes, but I gather Mayor Goff's not so keen on this. So they could end up with their entity being a bit of a zebra that has only a few stripes across Northland. I wonder about what that means for them in practical terms. I guess maybe that's their problem.
There is, and we are looking at potential options. And for the north, we've got a Northland Transportation Alliance, for example, which is working really well, and that's the three councils plus Waka Kotahi together, managing our transport infrastructure. So many would say that not very well, but we are working together, and there have been some really good efficiencies as a result of that. So we could have a similar model. It's really about the investment into the asset. If you took Waka Kotahi, for example, in our roads, the state highways are tax funded, and the local roads are a share between a tax and rates funded. So we think that the waters, there's a potential for maybe a funding model similar to that, and these options need to be considered. We've been told that they have been looked at and rejected, and that this model that's on the table is the best model. We don't agree.
It's all terribly dogmatic, isn't it? But you are resourceful people. You've already worked with your neighbours on other projects, and what it sounds like is you're proposing something similar could be done for water in the north and the three district councils there.
Potentially, we are looking at all options. From again, if the duty to my ratepayers, I would say that for us, the best option will be to continue to opt out. If our neighbours choose to opt into the entity and get that the cross subsidisation, great, good for them. But they need to do their own analysis as well. And we all need to every council in the country needs to be really drilling down, checking that the assumptions and the assurances that we've been offered are accurate for each entity themselves.
Okay. Hey, well, look, Sheryl, thank you so much. I just want to give you just in case, and you may not, but Was there anything, as the Mayor of Whangarei, for Whangarei residents or for people up and down New Zealand that you'd like to finally get across about this Three Waters issue?
I really want to stress that we all want the same thing. We want safe drinking water. We want a clean environment for the wastewater to be treated properly before it's discharged, and we want our stormwater to be fit for purpose. And we've got big issues with climate change and all those things. Leave it with the local councils. We are the best guardians that we find for those assets for our people. We're close to them. We know what they want and what they don't want. So, yeah, thank you.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Sheryl Mai, a mayor, who really, I think, has done the best for her residents. As she said multiple times through this discussion, her duty is to the residents of the Whangarei District Council area. And she's really taken the initiative, stood up to government, got independent analysis, and shown what the best way forward for the Whangarei District Council is, and made a decision. We need a few more politicians like that, but only the good die young. So I don't know if you're not standing again in the next election, that would be an example of such a political death. Thank you so much again, Sheryl. And for anyone interested in ACT's approach, and there were a few questions in the comments about this, our Three Waters policy we've discussed on ACT TV before. It was put in our policy section under threewatersact.org.nz/policies. The gist of it is we acknowledge that there's a problem. We don't think that the governance entities being proposed are the solution. However, we think that councils should be allowed to form alliances with their neighbours if they really think that they can do things better that way. And we should exempt any water system with fewer than 30 members, because a few neighbours sharing a bore shouldn't have the heavy hand of the state coming down on everything that they do. And we also believe in public-private partnerships between investors like the NZ Super Fund, for example, and local councils to get that money flowing and fix the 100-year-old pipes that Her Worship Sheryl Mai, Mayor of Whangarei, mentioned. That's our view, but please check it out for yourself on our website. I want to thank all of our guests this week. Thank all of our viewers. I hope that you've enjoyed ACT TV, and we'll be back next week. We're going to keep doing this until Auckland comes out of level 4. We're not going to abandon you, Jaffers, and we hope that you have a great night. Good night.